The Nikhil Hogan Show, brought to you by Songbird Music Academy.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Nikhil Hogan Show. I'm really happy to introduce my guest today, Professor Johannes Menke. In 2004, he received his doctorate with a thesis on Giacinto Scelsi at the TU Berlin. Since 2007, he has been the professor of historical theory at the Schola Cantorum Basilinius. His focus is on the music of the 16th and 17th centuries. These book publications include Counterpoint 1, the music of the Renaissance, and Counterpoint 2, the music of the Baroque. His work at the Schola Cantorum Basilinius includes subjects in the fields of Renaissance to Romantic music, early music, the history of music theory, as well as supervising doctoral projects. He is also the co-founder of the project series Klangwelt Renaissance and the Basel Forum for Music Aesthetics. Professor Menke, I'm really glad to have you on the show today.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the kind introduction.
One of your articles that I read was really interesting. It was the reception of Partimento in Germany. And I'm so interested about Germany because the great Professor Sanguinetti has explored Partimento with Italy. And I've talked to Professor Carlisi about the Partimento reception in France. But Germany would be a wonderful area of research. And I'd love to, first of all, let's begin. Can you frame the dialogue? What century are we talking about? And really, when did actually the idea of Germany, the state, actually come about?
So, yeah, we are talking about the Germany of the 19th century, of course, because it's the time of reception of Partimenti. And, of course, if we talk about the 19th century, there is no state of Germany until 1871, as everyone knows. So Germany is a very colorful region, where we have Austria and we have Prussia and other many little states.
How is it really divided? Is it by religion or just local culture?
It's a very difficult question. You see, of course, religion is one thing which divides the German-speaking countries, if we think about 30-year war. But especially in the 19th century, it's a political thing. So we have the end of the old Roman Empire, at the beginning of the 19th century. And then it's a big question, what should happen with this big thing in the center of Europe? Should it become again reunited under Prussia or under Austria or both together? This was an open question in the middle of the 19th century.
Okay, so let's turn it to music now. And the beginning of the 19th century, we have Beethoven. Mozart had passed away in the 1790s. And so now the landscape for music is entering the quote-unquote romantic era. And you, in your article, you mentioned two people, very interesting, Siegfried Dehn. Am I saying that correctly?
Exactly, Siegfried Dehn, yeah.
And Adolf Bernhard Marx. So first of all, why don't you just talk about Dehn first?
So Dehn, for me, is a very interesting music theorist. Because, so in my opinion, Dehn is one of my predecessors because he has done something like historically informed theory in his time. So he was mainly an historian who was interested in Orlando di Lasso or in Bach and other ancient composers. So he did editions of them, and he was a professor in Berlin. But he also was a very successful teacher. So some of his pupils became very famous after. One of them was Clara Wieck, for example, so Clara Schumann later, or Michael Glinka, Peter Cornelius, Anton Rubinstein.
Now, how was he trained? Was he trained in Germany?
Yes, he was trained in Germany, but always in Germany you find connections to France and Italy. So he was trained by Bernhard Klein, who was a very important and interesting person in Berlin. And this Bernhard Klein has studied at the conservatory in Paris with Luigi Cherubini. And so we have the connection to France and to Italy.
Germany, I mean, obviously Bach and Mozart, was there a general, so the word general bass or thorough bass or figured bass, that had already existed in Germany, correct?
Of course, it existed in Germany, and we have, if you go back to the 18th century, one of the most important treatises about thorough bass is, of course, Heinichen's Der Generalbass in der Komposition, published in 1728 in Dresden. So we know Dresden was a center of Baroque culture in the early 18th century, and of course the culture of thorough bass was very, very strong in the 18th century Germany.
that has parallels to Partimento, but it's not quite the same thing, right? I mean, it's
exactly, it's not the same thing. So we have not this repertoire of Partimento exercises as we find it in the famous conservatories in Naples. And I think it has to do with the institution of the conservatory, which just didn't exist in Germany in the 18th century.
Let's go back to Siegfried Dehn. So he obviously has some great students. You mentioned Anton Rubinstein, Michael Glinka. He had a dispute, or rather, he had somebody, an interlocutor, Adolf Bernhard Marx. First, talk about Adolf Bernhard Marx, because he's in a way quite a heavyweight too. He was very close contemporaries with the Mendelssohn family. He was a contemporary of Beethoven. So tell me a little bit about Marx. And this is not Karl Marx, this is Adolf Bernhard Marx.
Yes, it's not Karl Marx, so we have to be careful.
So we have to be careful, otherwise people will think we're talking about The Economist.
But maybe they are not so far, because also our Adolf Bernhard Marx was very fond of the ideas of revolution. So he also sustained the German Revolution in 1848. And he was a man who was he was a lawyer. This is one part of his life, and he was interested in progress of humanity, in progress of Germany. So he was full of those philosophical, pedagogical ideas. He wanted to make the world and Germany better.
Okay, right. How did he learn music?
So he also had a professional training with a quite famous teacher, Daniel Gottlob Türk. So maybe many of our audience knows Türk by his book about piano playing. And one of his colleagues was Karl Löwe, and another teacher was Karl Friedrich Zelter.
Would it be fair to say that his training was similar to that general bass line? Maybe he came out of that normal tradition?
I don't think so. I don't think that it was similar, because I guess that with Klein, the teacher of Dehn, there were more connections to France and Italy than in the training of Marx. But for Marx, there were also other things to be against the old tradition. So it has a little bit to do with his, say, ideology. Because for Marx, it was in his time, he observed a kind of fight between the good and the evil. And the good was, of course, the progress, and the good was a kind of a spiritual approach to music. It was the tradition of the big masters, the big German masters, Bach, Beethoven, and Handel. And he was against the old tradition, the ancient music, the ancien régime.
What artists would represent the ancient regime?
For Marx, the ancien régime was in the music were the old Italian masters and the tradition of thorough bass. And this is something we should leave, and we should forget it, and should go to a new world of the spiritual music and the masterwork.
But why would he say that when Bach himself would study neat and thorough bass and CPE Bach, and all these masters knew thorough bass very well?
Yeah, of course, this is a problem, in fact, but I don't know. Either Marx didn't know that, or maybe he didn't want to know that, but this was not a part of his idea. So he said thorough bass is something we have to forget, because thorough bass is something sensual. It sounds a bit crazy for us, but he really said it's something sensual. And it's for sensual music, which has not the same level as the spiritual music of Beethoven and Bach. Of course, but as I said, it's an ideology. It's a construction for him.
Obviously, when you want to replace something, you need to replace it with something. So what kind of music theory was he advancing? If we could get technical, what was different between his music theory and thorough bass?
So he had, of course, a very big idea of a new music theory. He wrote this very big book of Die Lehre von der musikalischen Komposition. So maybe already the title tells us something about this idea. Thorough bass only is a part of music, he would say, Marx, and he wants to teach everything. Yeah,
Okay.
all parts of composition. So harmony and form and so on, instrumentation, so everything you need to become a composer. And therefore, until today, the so-called Formenlehre of Marx had a great influence until today.
If thorough bass is just a part of it, are we talking about perhaps Roman numerals here, or is that later?
Yeah, no, for Marx wanted to forget thorough bass completely, because thorough bass was a part of the old world. And his approach to harmony is only based on modern methods of fundamental bass, Roman numerals, and so on.
By the way, just really quickly, Roman numerals, who came up with that?
The Roman numerals were used by Vogler. I think he was one of the first theorists who used the Roman numerals for fundamentals. And then, of course, the most important theorist for the Roman numerals was Gottfried Weber.
I was reading your article, and Marx was absolutely savage with thorough bass, and it almost seems like it goes beyond music theory and beyond music education and strikes at that nationalistic idea of identity and that sort of thing. And is that because thorough bass has roots in Italian traditions? Is that how it is?
Maybe also this was the reason that Italian music for him was the ancient music. And he wanted, for us it's a bit difficult to imagine this, but for progressive people in Germany this time, it was a part of being progressive to be natural. Yeah, so to be interested in nationalism and in the big German composers. This was an idea which comes from this time.
And there's some other people you mentioned, like, for instance, Ferdinand Hiller. Could you talk about Ferdinand Hiller and some other kinds of general bass examples and harmony books that were coming around at the time?
Ferdinand Hiller is more on the side of Dehn. So he's a very interesting personality. Hiller had connections to France and to Italy, and he was then director of the Conservatory of Cologne. And he published also a book about harmony. And in this book, we can find, this was a very big surprise when I saw it the first time, many partimenti by Fenaroli and Scarlatti and other old masters. So you see, Ferdinand Hiller, he was very open-minded to the old tradition. And I guess the majority of people were open-minded and they were still interested in the old tradition, because this was what happened in the classrooms.
And so Fenaroli, all this partimenti, so Hiller actually had Italian partimenti with him. Is that the same for Dehn? And does Marx actually mention the word partimenti? Now we can actually get into the reception of partimenti and Fenaroli in Germany.
As far as I know, Marx does not mention partimento. Dehn does mention partimento, and he also uses basso continuo exercises in his Harmonielehre. And this was exactly the thing which was disturbing for Marx. So when Marx was criticizing Dehn, he said, you are writing a Harmonielehre, but you are only doing thorough bass. So your Harmonielehre is not a real Harmonielehre because you are using basso continuo exercises. But he did this battle on a very philosophical level, because he said, die alte Musiklehre im Streit mit der neuen. Yeah, so the old teaching method fighting with the new teaching method. It was progress against, how could we say, reactionär, to go back.
One of the things that in the article mentioned that Partimento was perceived as deficient because it appeared to lack, quote-unquote, chord theory, that kind of vertical looking at chords.
Yeah, so this was the problem which Marx had with thorough bass, I think. This has to do with this old idea of the thorough bass as a skeleton of the composition. So we know that this term, that the thorough bass is the foundation and the skeleton of the composition, goes back to Albrechtsberger, an Austrian theorist in the end of the 18th and at the beginning of the 19th century. He was a teacher of Beethoven. And Marx was criticizing this idea.
No, you mentioned that book that he wrote, the Lehre, the composition book that was 4 volumes or something. And is that... Now, he was one of the founders of the Berlin Stein Conservatory. He was a professor of music at Berlin University. Were these influential positions, and so was his... So did he kind of win the battle, so to speak?
This is difficult to answer. So if we look at the pupils, I think Dehn has won because he had the more successful pupils.
Right. Do we have any of Marx's? Does Marx have any students of note that we know?
Not so many. So of course he had, but not so many as Dehn had. And of course both were rivals. Both were living in Berlin. And but if we look into history and if we go to the 20th century, of course, then Marx had more influence than Dehn later. And as we all know, the tradition of Partimento and thorough-bass was forgotten for a certain time, and we had to rediscover that.
Is it because his nationalism was a great kind of a flashpoint that people would rally around in a way? I noticed there was quite a bit of nationalism, and so was that starting. So in the sense that Dehn, was he particularly political in any way when he was arguing? Did they have a correspondence, or was it just one-sided?
So, now, I think Dehn was not political. He was an historian, and I guess he was not so interested in politics. So not in the same intensity as Marx was.
Now, the second part of that article is really fascinating. Is now we talk about Richard Wagner, who everybody knows as this progressive German, very German identity, very progressive harmony. But I was absolutely surprised to find out his training, which is very, I guess you could call it very cosmopolitan, very, very influenced by all sorts of cultures. So let's talk about Wagner, and let's talk about his teacher, Christian Theodor Weinlig. But first of all, before he met Weinlig, what was Wagner up to? What kind of music was he composing?
Of course, he started quite early to compose music, but when he came to Weinlig, he was quite young still. I'm not sure. I have to look. I think 16 or 17 years old. So he was really a very young composer, and he was searching his own way. But I think with Weinlig, he has found a very good teacher, and there was a very intensive training with him.
Who is Weinlig, first of all? Can you just give a brief biography of who Christian Theodor Weinlig was?
So to be honest, when I have read the first time this information, which is mostly underestimated in the research of Weinlig, I was very surprised that Weinlig was a pupil of Stanislao Mattei in Bologna. So in his own writings, Weinlig said, or called himself a Maestro of the Conservatory of Bologna.
A Maestro.
Yeah, a Maestro.
And that's an Italian word, right?
In his fugue book, there you can find it in the title. And because he had studied there. And then he had a quite important position. So he was Thomas Cantor in Leipzig, the same position Bach has had many years before. And so because of this important position, of course, Wagner went to him to find a good teacher.
I think Wagner writes about this in his autobiography. He talks about Weinlig, and it's a little bit, they talk about how he worked on, basically, was it counterpoint? Was that what they worked on in a big way?
Yes, there was one thing, but first maybe we have to emphasize that Wagner liked his teacher. We know that Wagner did not like all persons around him.
He is quite,
But obviously he admired his teacher, and he says that they had a good relation to each other. But it's not easy to reconstruct exactly what they did. So one information is that he said Weinlig was using a very easy method, and he said in German, unterrichtete eine spielend leichte Methode. Ja? Oder he taught spielend. And spielend can have two meanings in German. It can mean easy, or it can mean playing. So it also can mean that he teaches Wagner playing on the piano, as you do if you are playing Partimento. This is a possibility. And another thing where we have more precise information is that Weinlig taught Wagner in composition of fugues. One story Wagner tells is that he has given him a theme for a fugue, and then both the teacher and the pupil, they worked about this theme, and the next day they met again, and then they compared the results.
It's interesting because Bologna, Padre Martini, of course, is a very famous, taught Mozart, And also, it's interesting. Mattei was a student, so in a way, Wagner is like a grandchild in a way, right, of this Bologna kind of tradition.
Yes, Wagner is a grandchild, and he knew that. He also mentions in this autobiography that his teacher comes from the old Italian school.
When people think of Wagner, they think, wow, Tristan, look at all this progressive music and all of this. Now, if Marx were to look at that kind of music, he would analyze it with more progressive, like Roman numerals and that kind of thing. But if Wagner, if his training is to be believed, I mean, he would have probably composed all his music thinking in a more general bass sort of way, right?
It's very difficult to give information about this very long and complicated development of Wagner's composition technique. But of course, for his training, the training was based on thorough bass. This is very clear because if you look at some manuscripts we have from other pupils of Weinlig, he used, of course, basso continuo, but also he used inversion of chords and fundamentals because this was a very common thing in this time. Also, you can find inversions in the Neapolitan conservatories. And if you go to the early operas of Wagner, there, of course, he was very influenced by the Italian opera. On one hand, the Italian opera always was a kind of enemy because he wanted to establish a new German opera. But on the other hand, he was very fascinated by the Italian opera, especially by Vincenzo Bellini, a composer he admired all his life.
How do we know that he admired Bellini? Did he write down that he said, do we have a quotation from him?
We have many quotations about Bellini. I will publish in January an article about that. To anticipate a little bit, so Wagner has organized some performances of the Norma, so the most famous Bellini opera also in this time, in Riga. And we also find other short quotations where we see that he admired him absolutely. He even composed an aria for the Norma, Wagner. Wow. In the Bellini style. This is very funny.
He was very much a nationalist and had a pro-German identity. But this love for, this admiration for Bellini, did that always stay for his whole life, or did it end at a certain point and then he just became a German-only centric person?
We cannot know it exactly, but I believe it stayed for all of his life. We know that the older Wagner was not so aggressive, so he made a Rossini, for example,
he mellowed out.
Paris, and they had some nice hours together. So, as all people, when they become older, they become a little bit more relaxed. Course, but also, to be serious again, I think also in the late operas we can find still traces of Bellini's style. So one thing where also other scholars have emphasized this influence is Tristan. Yeah, so the end of the Tristan, the famous Liebestod, is influenced by the finale of Norma. And in my article, I will show how.
Most people, when they think of classical music, it's always very German-centric, and there are absolutely, all the top German names are wonderful musicians. But what was the reception of Italian music in Germany? Was opera very big? He liked Bellini, but did Italian opera penetrate into Germany and have a kind of influence, kind of like how it did in France?
Yes, of course it had an influence. Of course we have not the same opera culture in Germany, but Bellini, and the same is for Rossini, was one of the most important opera composers in Paris. And Paris was the most important opera city in Europe in the 19th century. So therefore, it was clear that Bellini is a composer you cannot avoid in the first half of the 19th century. And as we have seen before, Wagner even performed Bellini operas in Riga, so very far away.
Let's talk about the Partimento again. So you mentioned that, of course, Hiller had Fenaroli. Did other German theorists, do we have mentions of the word Partimento or Partimenti in German harmony textbooks in the 19th century?
So I think we cannot find it so often. One example, of course, is Hiller. In other traditions, we find generalbass-Übungen. So one famous example is Reinberger, composed a little bit later. And if you look in the textbooks about Harmonielehre in German, you almost always find basso continuo exercises. Of course, they are not called partimenti, but the function is sometimes very similar.
Now, the difference between, for instance, like a partimento is there's a complete lack of figures. Did that in some way influence as well the basso continuo tradition, the general bass, or is it kind of like Bologna where you had figures in your exercises for your bass lines?
Yeah, of course, in Germany, coming from the 18th century, the tradition of using always the figures was more strong than this very typical Italian tradition of using basses without figures.
I've noticed that sometimes some concepts might travel to a different country, but even though the concept is the same, the name might completely be different. So it might be a partimento in everything but name. For instance, the rule of the octave, is there something similar in German harmony?
Yeah, I was very surprised to find the rule of the octave in these manuscripts of pupils of Weinlig.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so obviously also Weinlig teaches Wagner the rule of the octave. And if you go to Dehn, in his Harmonielehre, Dehn mentions the rule of the octave, but it has not the same theoretical dignity he wanted to have for Harmonielehre. I think this was one of the problems of the rule of the octave already in the 18th century, that the people said, okay, it's very suitable for the practice, but it's not a real theory. If you want, the first person who said this was Rameau. Yeah? Who said we have to find la raison, how Rameau would say, of music, and not only empirical and practical things.
Right. This is just my theory, but is it because since it's such an oral tradition in Italy, and the people who wrote books often, if you write something down, probably more people will read it and it'll be disseminated easier. If you don't write down these mystifying bass lines with no figures and very scarce rules, it's kind of hard to translate to other countries because they will assume that you don't have that chord theory. They might assume that there's deficiencies in the partimento theory.
Yeah, I think this touches a problem of research today, because today we are very concentrated on the big books. So one of the big books is the Kompositionslehre by Marx, for example. And then we think, these big books, they were representative for the music theory of this time. But of course, we don't know what happened really in the classrooms. And this can be very different from the things we can find in the big books.
What are the famous harmony books in Germany, if you could mention a couple of them?
I think if you look at the books, of course, Weber had a big influence with his theory of the Roman numerals, a theory which is used until today. Then we have another book, maybe I could mention here. This is by Bernhard Logier, who was a quite innovative theorist. And we know that Wagner also has read the Logier book. And one of the ideas of Logier was to fetch the harmony from nature, means from the overtones. And he tried to construct a method based completely on the overtones.
Can we talk a little bit about Gottfried Weber and his influence in Germany?
Yeah, Gottfried Weber, of course, because his book were printed, of course, there was a reception. And if you look in later books, especially Richter, for example, all other books, they used the Roman numerals. And I to be honest, not all. We also can find some very interesting books who are not using the numerals. For example, one theorist who is describing very modern methods was Carl Friedrich Weizmann. So he has the same age as Wagner had, and he was a kind of apologete of Wagner and Liszt. And this Weizmann, he wrote very crazy books, a monography about chords. Yeah, one book is only about der übermäßige Dreiklang is the title. So it's about the chord with the augmented fifth. Another book is only about the diminished seventh chord. Look in these books, you will find very modern progressions. It's a really interesting theory. All of them are written in the 1850s, but you will find no Roman numerals and no fundamentals. But also you'll find no thorough bass. There is also a third way.
Could I ask, Adolf Bernhard Marx was a good friend with Mendelssohn. How did Mendelssohn learn music? Was he a general bassist or was he kind of a more progressive student?
So the generation of Mendelssohn, in this generation, we have to assume that all composers have learned by thorough bass. And also they have learned the fundamentals because they were very widespread. And if you look into the life of Mendelssohn, so we find in his pieces even a big interest in ancient music. So we all know he was interested in Bach and performed the Matthäus Passion in 1829 and so on. Of course, he was not completely against thorough bass.
Johann Georg Albrechtsberger, we mentioned him earlier, he taught Beethoven and he was kind of a gallant person, right? Because he was in the 18th century. So was he familiar with kind of the Italian methods, or was he more of a general bassist?
So he was really a general bassist, yes. So one of the most quoted passages of his books is the famous preface of his writings, where he writes that in German, der Generalbass ist die Fundamentalbasis der ganzen Musik. So it's the thorough bass is the foundation of all the music, of all composition, and you can find in the thorough bass the skeleton, and so he compares it with human anatomy. So we are nothing about our skeleton, and so the music composition is nothing about the thorough bass.
Now, how about this? How does this relate to counterpoint? Because I've read that thorough bass is often thought of as accompaniment, not so much a total method for composing free composition. Is counterpoint separate from thorough bass?
Yeah, this is a very big question, of course. So if we concentrate on only on the 19th century, we can observe one development coming from Italy, mainly, where a thorough bass was used to teach also counterpoint. So, nevertheless, we have beside the old tradition of counterpoint, especially in the interest in the Renaissance counterpoint. So we can find both traditions in Italy. And if we go to Germany, and if we go, let's take Dehn, for example. So Dehn wrote a book about harmony, and there he used, for the practical harmony, the thorough bass exercises. But when he writes about a counterpoint, he had a very clear idea of the difference. He said, if you do harmony or thorough bass, you always start with the bass. If you do counterpoint, you can start with every voice. This is the big difference.
Oh, okay, like the cantus firmus, right?
Cantus firmus, exactly. Cantus firmus can appear in soprano, alto, tenor, bass, what you want.
If I were a student in Germany in the early 19th century, how would I learn to be a composer? What kind of diet of education would I be put through?
So if you are open to thorough bass, of course, you can go to Ferdinand Hiller, and then you have a training which is very similar to the training in Paris or in Italy. But if you feel more close to Max, you can go to Berlin.
Is it by city? Do different cities almost have different domains of music theory?
I think it's really it depends on the city. Look, if we go to the 19th century, we have a time of transition where the conservatories in all German-speaking cities were founded. Unfortunately, this history of the conservatories in Germany is not written, so there is no book about that. But at the moment, many scholars are trying to research about that. So, for example, one student, her name is Juliane Brandes, and she wrote a doctoral dissertation about the Münchner school. So she concentrated only about the tradition in Munich. And if you really want to answer your question, you have to have such a research for every conservatory in the German-speaking countries, and then in the end you can find an answer maybe.
In the Neapolitan tradition, solfeggio, which is singing and learning counterpoint and the study of melody, that is a pretty important part of the Neapolitan tradition. In German-speaking countries, is there an equivalent in choral singing where you kind of learn counterpoint at the same time?
I guess yes. But again, to be honest, we have to have more research about that. So we don't know enough about the education, how it was in the conservatories in Germany, and we have to have more books like the one of Juliane Brandes, where we try to reconstruct those teaching methods. Another colleague is Birger Petersen, and he has worked about Reinberger and about his Generalbass-Übungen. And of course, there you can find many things which are very near to the old Italian tradition. But it's always very difficult to reconstruct what happened in the classrooms. The same is for the Italian partimenti. So we also don't know, of course, many scholars try to reconstruct it, but we cannot be absolutely sure what they really did.
How do you learn music the general bass way?
You mean if you want to compose in a similar way, like as Schubert or Schumann did?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that maybe your approach should not only be one, because we should be in a similar situation as the composers were in this time. So on one, of course, we should know the old tradition of thorough bass, because most composers until the Wagner generation were trained in this tradition. On the other hand, they were influenced and they were very interested in new methods. So we also should know these new ideas. And in the 19th century, you always find both. Look at a composer like Franz Liszt. Yeah, you can find in his biography also these foundations of tradition, but then you also find very modern ideas and pieces. Sans tonalité. He has written a piece without tonality in the title. Yeah? So you can see how complicated the situation in the 19th century was.
Wasn't his teacher Carl Czerny, who was a student of Beethoven, who was a student of Albrechtsberger? So is that tradition there as well, exactly. The general bass theory?
Exactly. This is the tradition. And if you look, there's this famous treatise about improvising preludes by Czerny, which is completely based on the old methods to use a chord progression based on thorough bass, and then you do more and more diminutions and with all the piano techniques.
Now, you mentioned newer methods. Are these from music theorists, or where did these ideas germinate from? Where does that all come from, really?
Yeah, this is a difficult question. So if we take one example. Let's take the famous chord with augmented fifth, which was used by Wagner and by Liszt at the same time. It was in the 1850s, and where they tried to do experiments with that chord, to do more modulations, to use this chord everywhere. There we can find that the already mentioned Carl Friedrich Weizmann wrote his monography about the same chord exactly in the same time. It was written in 1853. So who was the first? So obviously something is in the air, and the people are interested in developing that.
The ideas actually stem from the progressive music theory of the chord, people who are coming up with the new chords.
So if we look at the treatise of Weizmann, so what he is doing is very similar to that what you say. So he takes the augmented chord, and then he just tries out, what can I do with the augmented fifth? I can go up, I can go down. What could be the next chord? It's a really experimental situation, but you can find similar situations in this course of Wagner and Liszt. So if you take Wagner, there is one prelude in the Walküre. Where he always takes the same augmented triad, and he resolves them in a different way, very similar to the methods Weizmann shows in his book. Or if you go to Liszt in his Faust Symphony, he just takes the chord, and then he brings the same chord one semitone higher or lower. So he just tries out, what can I do with the chord?
You teach at the Schola Cantorum Basilinius, and for me, I mean, that's an amazing school, because for me, it's like this epicenter of all this classical improvisation, and I'm very interested in music education, and now that all of these things are being revived, how can we influence music education now?
I think this is an important thing, the consequences of our research for music education. Of course, in my school, in the Schola Cantorum Basiliensis, I'm teaching students who will become musicians later, but also they will be teachers in their instruments. So I can try to give them a good education in historical informed music theory, and then I hope they will use it later when they also teach. And on the other side, I also teaching theory and theory teachers in the future. And there we have a subject called methodic, so where we discuss pedagogical questions. And very often we discuss this question, how can we use historically informed theory today? Where can we use which theory, and so on?
Now, with regard to music theory, that's quite, there's so many methods, and of course everybody knows Schenker, everybody knows Riemann, and now we have Partimento and general bass and set theory. So the modern student, what would you teach them? Because there's so many methods. What's a practical, effective method that, or rather, what would you teach when it comes to music theory?
So if I teach here at the Schola Cantorum, we have a very big repertoire. The repertoire starts in 850. And it ends in 1850. So we have 1,000 years of music history. And I think an important experience for every student should be that there is not only one theory. So that theory is something which develops and which changes. And even you can find in the same time different theories if you go to different countries, for example, sometimes corresponding to different styles. And I think we as theory teachers, we have to be very honest, and we have to show our students, all students, that there are different theories and that they try to learn to use different theories. This is very good for their musical brain, I think.
It's kind of contentious now with the Roman numerals. Everyone is questioning them. But, I mean, if you were to teach romantic music, would you use Roman numerals to explain romantic pieces?
Yeah, it depends. So you can try, and sometimes you are successful, sometimes less. And I think in romantic analyzing romantic music, we have really to do a mixture of things. So we can explain many things, of course, with the old Arabic numbers related to the real bass degrees. So many colleagues have done before, and you can even analyze the entire Tristan prelude with the old zero bass method. It works perfectly. There's no problem. But on the other hand, this is not the entire truth, because for composers like Wagner and in his time, of course, we have also other theories in the world. And you also, in some situations, you find the composer is using inversions of chords, for example. And then it would be stupid to say, no, I don't believe in inversion of chords. Yeah, this is we should not be dogmatic.
What music would be a good use? What artist or what composer, what works would be useful to use chord inversions and fundamental bass and Roman numerals?
So of course, chord inversion has a long history. So chord inversion is an idea which is older than the modern use of chord inversion. You can find the idea of inversion even in Heinichen. But the difference is that Heinichen inverts every chord. So also it's possible to invert 6-4-2 chord. Yeah? You don't have to start with the triad or with the seventh chord. Later, according to Rameau, you start with the triad and seventh chord, and let's take Mozart. If you study the Mozart exercises we have written by his own hand, he uses both methods. So he uses methods with fundamentals. So we know that, and we have the evidence. So of course we can try to do exercises in the Mozart style with this method. So it is an historical informed method in this time. On the other hand, Mozart also uses thorough bass and rule of the octave. So we should consider that he has both in his hands.
That leads to a question where, okay, if if you can use a lot of different tools, then what would you use? Would you expect a student to learn all the tools?
Not all the tools. It depends. So if you stay for one moment in the Mozart time, in this time we can see in many books that the authors start not with the bass but with the melody. You can see it in the famous Riepel or also in Koch. Always the melody is composed first, and then the bass comes later. And because of this development, I think this flexibility in the methods is very useful. Because for some students it could be helpful to start also with the melody and then to find a bass using the traditional through bass method or the modern with fundamentals and inversions, because both could correspond to this new approach starting with the melody.
Now, Professor Menke, time is running out, so could you just mention you mentioned you have an upcoming article on Wagner, but could you mention any other projects you have lined up and what do you have planned for 2020?
For 2020. So at the moment I'm working on a very big project about French Baroque music. But because it's just not finished, I cannot tell too much about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there any way people can find more of your work?
So my writings are, of course, they are printed and published, but you also can find them on Academia, on the website. And you'll find an overview of my writings on the website of my school. So I think it should be not too difficult to find it.
I guess my final question would be, if you could reform music education, what things would you change? What things would you keep? What things would you want to see more emphasized?
It depends whether we are talking about school or music school or university. Because there are different things to change, and it depends on the country. You see, I'm teaching at Schola Cantorum in Basel, and our students they come from all over the world. So I can answer this question only if you ask me situation in a specific school, because the situations are very different. They're different.
Do you think everyone should learn general bass?
Everyone should learn thorough bass. So yeah, I would say everyone who is doing the tonal music should study thorough bass. I would absolutely agree, because without thorough bass you cannot understand the tonal music.
Oh, Adolf Bernhard Marx is not going to like what you just said.
No, he would not like that. But
Well, Professor Menke, it's really a fantastic work you've done. I love the article. It really gave some new ideas on particularly perception about Wagner, and especially the reception of Partimento, and really the really rich tradition of general bass in Germany. I think more people are getting hip to that, and they like it, and they're finding it interesting. And so I applaud your work, and I can't wait to read more of your work. Thank you for coming on the show, and I hope you'll come on again when your next article drops and we can talk about that article.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for listening to this interview. I'm so honored to be able to talk to all of my guests. They are the best in the business. If you enjoyed the show, I'd really appreciate if you shared it on social media and hit subscribe for future guests. Check out nikhilhogan.com for updates on my upcoming book, Why Children Quit Music, and check out songbirdmusicacademy.com for free resources on how to learn music. Thanks again, and I'll see you at the next show.